What's up, Carbon Collective? My name's Zach Stein. I'm one of our founders, and today I want to go over our thoughts on a really important question that we get a lot, which is, if you're a climate-focused investor, should you own ExxonMobil to vote on them? They are one of the worst companies from a climate perspective, and should we use the important power of voting as a shareholder to get companies like them to move faster on climate? So we've given this a lot of thought, and the answer that we've come pretty securely to is no, you should not own them. Despite some of the really amazing symbolic victories that have happened, we don't think that even in the best case scenario, voting on ExxonMobil can have much of a real climate benefit to it. And even more so, that fossil fuel companies have shown again and again that they are not partners to act in good faith with on the climate issue. So in this video, we want to walk through all of that and then end with where we think that the best place that climate-focused investors are, where we can use those votes to drive as much impact as we can. Thanks so much. Let's go dig in. Okay, before we get into this, let's make something really clear. What engine number one was able to do with ExxonMobil was symbolically amazing. It inspired the world, and it showed that investors like Carbon Collective and investors like you can stand up to some of the largest and most polluting companies that are out there. And so we need to absolutely give them the credit for that inspiration. But inspiration is not enough. When it comes to solving climate change, what we have to do is really clear. We need this graph to plateau and then quickly start declining on the other end. And pressuring a company, a single company like ExxonMobil, to do that, to voluntarily limit its supply, is just not going to be effective when it comes to that. Because when we look at an ExxonMobil, what we'd be pressuring to do, let's assume the best case scenario, that engine number one's campaigns, their board directors, their coalition that they're able to build, gets ExxonMobil to say, okay, we're going to get out of the oil business. That would mean that they would take areas of land like this that they have mineral rights to. They take, oil rigs that they own and things like that, and they'd start putting them up for sale to get out of that business. That could mean that there's a lot of cash maybe freed up to be invested in renewables, and that's the big positive here. But it doesn't actually lead to any reduction in overall consumption. It wouldn't actually lead to this graph starting to go down, because very simply, these other companies could just buy those mineral rights. And even if you force those companies to, there are plenty of companies that are privately held, some of the biggest in the world, that are oil companies, that could come in and buy here, that as investors in publicly traded companies, we would have no ability to force or use our votes to force them to. So what that means is focusing on any individual fossil fuel company, trying to get them to divest their assets, is simply just not going to be effective. It's just moving around ownership of fossil fuel assets that are going to get worked so long as there is demand. Now, let's say that it doesn't matter, that moving around of assets, that here what the actual impact is that if we can get ExxonMobil to come out and say that they are leaving the oil business, the symbolism of that victory could be extreme. And that it could kick off a cascade of sales. It could say other companies, these other companies that are looking here, they could say, oh my God, ExxonMobil's getting out of this business, then we better should too, because we don't know when the music's going to stop, but we want to make sure that we have a chair and that we get out in time. And so we're not the ones left with those stranded assets. So that could be really powerful if ExxonMobil was able to do that. The problem with that is that ExxonMobil, if it really made that choice to get out of the oil business, they would have every incentive to do so very quietly. They would slowly sell assets. They would not make a big deal about it, because they would want those assets to retain their value. They still want to give a return to their shareholders. And if they come out and say, hey, oil is a terrible business to be in, will you buy my oil rig? It's not a great sales strategy. Let's use an analogy. Let's say that you own a bunch of apartment buildings in a given city, and that you decide, I want to get out of the apartment building business. And would you write an op-ed in the local newspaper talking about why the apartment building business is a bad one to be in? before you start selling those assets? No, you wouldn't say anything of the sort. You'd actually say the opposite. Or you'd say that, oh, apartment buildings are great to be in, come buy mine and you'll make so much money. I just, I'm ready to retire and I want to get out of it. This is going to be the same case with ExxonMobil and oil. So likelihood of a cascading kind of symbolic victory there is very low because it would go against ExxonMobil's incentives to come out and say, hey, we're getting out of the oil business because it's a bad business to be in. The other piece that's really important to talk about here, and often just frankly isn't talked about enough, is that fossil fuel companies have shown again and again that they are not ready to act in good faith when it comes to climate change. They talk increasingly a really big game. ExxonMobil here announced their ambitions for net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Okay, what does that actually mean? That means that their burning or their extraction of fossil fuels. So, often it can bring up natural gas and stuff like that. They're going to find some way to not have that have emissions. The technology doesn't really exist to do that yet. It's been tried again and again, and it just simply doesn't work. So it's unclear whether that's going to be the case. And this doesn't actually mean that they're going to change the amount of fossil fuels that they're extracting. Remember, we need this to go down. So even if extracting oil results in zero emissions from the extraction, the actual burning of that oil in a car or in a jet is still going to have the same emissions. So it's not whatsoever actually aligned with climate change. It's just trying to make it sound good. And this is what we see again and again from the fossil fuel industry, is that when it comes to climate, they love to engage in these delaying tactics and say, hey, look at all the good work that we're doing. Look how we're actually your friend in climate, in making this transition. The problem is that talk is really cheap in this space, and they are just experts at it. Let's look at what BP was able to do. It has gotten caught doing. So this is in 2019, which is that BP, again, this is a organization that went through a PR nightmare with the Horizon oil spill, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. They launched in 2019 a series of ads focusing in Britain about how BP was a climate forward energy company. The ads were great and they were very well received, but BP is now being sued because they, for the level of misleading for that ad campaign. The solar panels that BP showed, making it seem like they were very much investing in this transition and leaving oil and fossil fuels behind, was simply not the case. And I quote, "This is a smokescreen. While BP's advertising focuses on clean energy, in reality, more than 96% of the company's annual capital expenditure is on oil and gas. According to its own figures, BP is spending less than £4 in every 100 on low carbon investments each year. The rest is fueling the climate crisis." There is a putting your money where your mouth is, because it's so cheap to pretend like you're going to be in good faith. It is an actual delaying tactic while these companies can keep making money in the way that they have been. Another kind of crazy example that is closer to home, at least here in California, is about the natural gas industry. This is really nuts that the fossil fuel industry has hired people to micro-target next-door groups to protest natural gas bans in those areas. This is not natural gas bans for your existing construction. No one's going to come in and rip out your stove. This is just on new construction, but they are seeding this space with a level of misinformation that is just pretty nuts, and it really clouds the conversation. This is a classic tactic that the fossil fuel industry loves to take. In terms of not acting with good faith, we've seen them do this very explicitly. Let's go back to this pledge here that they said that, all right, even let's say they're going to keep extracting oil and doing all of that, fine, but at least they're going to do so without emissions, right? Well, we've actually seen far more binding pledges in this. There is no teeth in this whatsoever. Nothing will happen to the executives if this doesn't pass. They'll also likely be long retired by the time 2050 rolls around. What we have seen was an agreement with the government of Guyana to limit exactly this. This was flaring from their oil rigs that were extracting oil off of the coast of Guyana. And they said that they would use technology that resulted in zero flaring. But it simply didn't work. And it got to the point that the government has reported that 15.1 billion cubic feet of gas have been flared as of July 2021. So that's 5 years of usage. So a contract with a government, so not an agreement made just with ExxonMobil in itself. ExxonMobil clearly said that it was happy to trample all over it, and then knowing that it could come in later and basically rewrite the rules for it. So this is in short why we believe that engaging with an individual fossil fuel company is very unlikely to have any climate impact. And even if you were trying to, in the best case scenario, they have shown time and time again that they will mislead and misdirect and pretend like they are going to be actors that are going to be helpful in the climate space, just as a way of buying time and getting climate activists off their backs so they can keep doing what they're doing behind the scenes. Fossil fuel companies are not the friends of climate change and solving it. They're very much still its enemies. So, okay, where should climate activist investors focus their votes in this space? That's where this whole discussion began. Clearly, we don't believe it should be fossil fuel companies. Let's go back to this graph. How do we get this graph to come down? Focusing on getting fossil fuel companies to voluntarily restrict supply just doesn't make sense. Instead, we need to get companies who use fossil fuels, who use them to generate electricity, who use them to transport their goods and services in their fleets. We need to get them to switch to zero emissions ways of doing that. We need to decrease the demand for fossil fuels. And there are a lot of companies out there who use a lot of fossil fuels, but not for their core business. For example, superstores. Walmart, Target, IKEA, etc., they have large flat roofs. This really interesting report that came out showed that if every big box store in the US put solar panels on its roof, it would enable solar. That would be equivalent to, wait for it, 8 million Americans' homes of energy. America still makes a lot of electricity from coal and natural gas. That's a lot of coal and natural gas demand that will simply go down. When you look at solar, it makes sense as an investment, and there's a huge amount of potential. Walmart is the biggest group here that was focused on. Home Depot was another one. They have solar on only 70 out of their 2,000 stores. For something that makes money for those stores, these are the places where we can use our shareholder advocacy to get companies like this to make commitments that can literally be tracked with a satellite. You can see if a company has put solar panels on there to get them to move and decrease demand in fossil fuels. So when it comes to it, these are the types of companies where we should be focusing our climate activist investor energy. It's not as exciting about taking it directly to the enemy in the same way of doing it with Exxon Mobil, but that's a smokescreen. That's not going to actually get us where we need to go in terms of climate. And with this, we can have really tangible benefits. By focusing on the companies that have a demand for fossil fuels and reducing it, that's where we get the benefits here from a climate perspective, and that's exactly where our votes should be going. So would love to get your questions and comments. Why are we wrong? Why are we right? And I'll see you next month from Carbon Collective.